In the summer of 1815, a crowd gathered around a strange machine on a colliery wagonway at Philadelphia in County Durham. It was called Brunton's Mechanical Traveller, a steam locomotive that didn't roll on driving wheels like the engines we'd come to know, but shuffled forward on a pair of mechanical legs bolted to its rear. The locals had never seen anything like it. They pressed in close to watch. And then the boiler exploded. Fragments of iron and scalding water tore through the crowd. When the smoke cleared, at least 13 people were dead. Most of them weren't railway workers. They were bystanders, families, people who'd walked over to see what all the noise was about. It was the first recorded boiler explosion on any railway, anywhere. And over the next century and a half, at least 137 more would follow on British railways alone. So why couldn't anyone stop it? Nobody was paying attention to what a locomotive boiler could actually do. Not in 1815, and not for decades afterwards. The railways were growing faster than anyone could regulate, and the boiler was just the thing that made the wheels turn. Every locomotive carried one. A long steel barrel filled with water, wrapped around a firebox where coal burned at temperatures that could soften metal. But the machine that powered this revolution had a flaw built into its design, and it was sitting in the worst possible place. The weak point was a plate of copper called the crown sheet. It formed the ceiling of the firebox, the hottest part of the entire locomotive. The only thing protecting it from the furnace below was the water sitting on top of it inside the boiler. As long as that water covered the crown sheet, the copper stayed cool enough to hold against the staybolts that pinned it to the outer shell. But if the water level dropped, even by a few inches, the crown sheet was exposed directly to the fire. And copper does not just melt at furnace temperatures. At around 550 degrees, it goes soft. It loses its tensile strength. Engineers called it going plastic. The plate stops behaving like a structural component and starts behaving like a lid that can no longer hold what is behind it. What was behind it was boiler water under 200 pounds per square inch of pressure, superheated to nearly 200 degrees, held in its liquid state only by that pressure. The moment the crown sheet gave way, the pressure vanished, and all of that superheated water flashed to steam in tenths of a second. The force blew the boiler apart from the inside. Locomotives were hurled off the rails. Fireboxes split open and scattered iron fragments across engine sheds and platforms. Drivers and firemen on the footplate rarely survived. There was a safety device that was supposed to prevent this. A small threaded cylinder called a fusible plug was screwed into the crown sheet, with a core made of tin or a soft alloy. Richard Trevithick had invented it back in 1803 after one of his own engines nearly killed him. If the water dropped below a safe level, the plug was supposed to overheat. The soft core would melt, and a jet of steam into the firebox would warn the crew before the crown sheet itself failed. It was a clever idea, but it would prove hopelessly inadequate over and over again for the next 150 years. In June 1831, a fireman on the best Friend of Charleston in South Carolina grew tired of the constant hissing from the steam safety valve. So he tied it shut. The boiler pressure climbed past its capacity, and the engine blew apart, hurling the boiler 25 feet into the air and killing him. That was the first locomotive boiler explosion in America, and it happened because a man wanted some quiet. 9 years later, in November 1840, the locomotive Surprise was standing in Bromsgrove Station in Worcestershire when its boiler exploded without warning. The driver, Thomas Scaife, and the foreman of locomotives, Joseph Rutherford, were both killed. Their gravestones still stand in St. John's churchyard in Bromsgrove, carved with the image of a locomotive, a permanent memorial on a stretch of railway that would keep killing. Just 5 months later, a boiler tube on a different engine ruptured on the same Lickey Incline. Scalding steam blasted through the firebox door and fatally burned the superintendent of locomotives, William Cruz. 3 dead men on one stretch of track in under half a year, and every one of them killed by the same machine. Those were just the incidents that made the papers. Across Victorian Britain, boiler explosions were happening in engine sheds, goods yards, cotton mills, and factories. Between 1864 and 1874, the Manchester Steam Users Association recorded 617 people killed and nearly 1,000 injured from boiler explosions across all industries. Not all of those were locomotive boilers, but the railways contributed a steady, grinding share. Christian Hewison, who spent years cataloguing the specifically railway disasters, recorded at least 137 locomotive boiler explosions in Britain between 1815 and 1962. The dead were overwhelmingly working men. Engine drivers and firemen had no say in maintenance schedules, no access to pressure records, and no right to refuse a locomotive they thought was unsafe. If you have been watching this series, you will recognize the pattern. The same thing happened in the mines, where the deadliest machine went unchecked for decades because the men it killed were considered expendable. If you have not seen that one yet, the link is on screen. Hit subscribe, because there are more of these coming. By 1855, a group of engineers and mill owners in Manchester had decided the government was not going to act. William Fairbairn and Joseph Whitworth founded the Manchester Steam Users Association, the first boiler inspection authority in Britain. They hired qualified engineers to physically examine boilers, identify cracks and corrosion and weaknesses in the stays, and recommend repairs before something gave way. The whole scheme was voluntary. No law compelled anyone to join. The government, despite years of evidence and a growing body count, still refused to legislate mandatory inspections. But by 1896, the association had tracked 44 boiler explosions across the country in a single year, and only one had occurred in a boiler belonging to a member. Inspection worked. The problem was that most boiler operators never signed up. The association's inspectors recommended the same fixes for decades: better fusible plugs, more reliable water gauges, stricter maintenance intervals. And for decades, those recommendations were only partially adopted. The plugs were supposed to be the last line of defense, but the soft alloy cores clogged with scale and calcium deposits from the boiler water. They failed to melt when they needed to, and if the water had already dropped below the crown sheet, there was nothing left above the plug to flow into the firebox anyway. The warning came too late, or not at all. During the Second World War, 3 American Lend-Lease locomotives exploded in service on British railways between 1943 and 1944. The crews were unfamiliar with the different boiler designs. An inspecting officer investigated and recommended that an improved type of fusible plug be fitted across all depots with the least possible delay. By August of the following year, the improved plugs still had not reached every depot. Another driver and fireman were killed. That failure was raised in Parliament in March 1945. The parliamentary secretary confirmed that production of the improved plugs had been delayed. The men were already buried. And it happened again. In 1948, the fusible plugs on a Coronation-class locomotive called Princess Alexandra melted near Lamington in Scotland, but the escaping steam was dispersed by the firebox draft, and the crew never noticed. The crown sheet collapsed anyway. The locomotive boiler killed more British railwaymen than any single type of collision across the entire steam age. And in the end, the solution was not a better plug or a stronger crown sheet or a more rigorous inspection schedule. It was a completely different engine. When diesel traction replaced steam across Britain's railways in the 1950s and the 1960s, the boiler explosion disappeared. 150 years of incremental safety improvements, and the only thing that actually stopped the killing was abandoning the machine entirely. Back in 1815, the crowd at Philadelphia had pressed in close to watch Brunton's mechanical traveller shuffle forward on its iron legs. Nobody warned them to stand back. Nobody understood what 200 pounds of steam pressure could do to a copper firebox. By the 1940s, everybody understood. The plugs had just been delayed. The same story played out underground, with a different machine and an even worse death toll. That video is on screen now.